Well, that clearly suggests that Pakistan is supporting the indirect channels. And I think the format is not important. What is important is that the dialogue should carry forward, should be carried forward, and some meaningful progress has to be made. I think that is the important part because you see, we all know what happened. Like President Trump has made statements about that. The Iranian leadership has made statements about that. There were certain proposals that had been handed over to Iran by the Americans, and then they were wanting, and in fact, Trump was pushing for that for a response to those proposals. And presumably, during this Iranian foreign minister's visit to Pakistan, some sort of a response from Iran would have been conveyed through Pakistan to the Americans, and that is why the American negotiators team would be here. They're likely to arrive in Pakistan. So that is so indirectly, it's the process is being carried forward, and so the hope here is that this number one, that the process continues because that is very important. There's no return to hostilities because Pakistan, through a remarkable diplomacy, was able to bring the two sides from the brink of a monumental disaster that would have been a disaster for the entire world, from there to the negotiating table. And after 50 years, it was historic because after 50 years, the two sides were meeting face to face at that level. So that happened. But beyond that, if there are more rounds of face-to-face talks, it would be great. But short of that, if there would be indirect talks through Pakistan, a country that both these parties, these warring parties, they trust, and given the fact that they have a huge trust deficit between them, Pakistan can sort of leverage that trust to fill some of that gap. So I believe that it was a very positive initiative on Iran's part, this visit of the foreign minister to Pakistan. And, the American side has responded to that by sending their negotiating team. Iranian foreign minister would also be meeting the Omanese leadership, the Russians, and, there are very many speculations as to why these two countries. In my opinion, there could be a couple of solid reasons. One is that Oman was part of the previous negotiations that they were having. In fact, that Oman was the mediator before Pakistan. Secondly, Oman is the country which has territorial waters on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. So anything that has to be done about the Strait of Hormuz, I think Omanis need to be involved in that. On the other side, Russians, okay, there's a strategic partnership between Russia and Iran. There's a great deal of defense cooperation, but also the fact that after the JCPOA was signed in 2015, thousands of kilograms of enriched uranium, as per that agreement, part of that was handed over to Russia in that instance. So in that way, also Russia could be an important actor because that issue is still lingering on. The issue of 450 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to the tune of about 60%. So that has to be handed over to some country, a third party, or it has to be downblended in Iran. So Russia could support that process in different ways possible. So that is there as well. Well, what the Iranians have been publicly stating is that the blockade should end. The U.S. blockade of Iran, the naval blockade. They were willing, at least until a few days back, to simultaneously lift the blockade that they have ensured through a threat of force blockade of Strait of Hormuz. So I think if that happens simultaneously, that would be the best case scenario. If both the countries agree on a mechanism whereby the naval blockade and the blocking of Strait of Hormuz by Iran both are lifted simultaneously, with whatever caveats they could agree upon. Ideally, there should be no caveats. But in case there are some caveats, they should be mutually agreed upon. I think that would be the best case scenario. That would be a great confidence building exercise. It's very clear that President Trump wants a swift end to this war. because of the economic costs involved, um, and especially because of the political cost involved. Because up to this point, the Republican majority that he enjoys, especially the MAGA constituency, has been rock solid. That support has been rock solid. But the most recent polls suggest that now that that it's getting a little more fragile. So that is a worrying sign for President Trump, because he doesn't really care about his overall popularity in the country. He always is more focused on his popularity within the Republican camp, particularly the MAGA constituency. So if that wavers a bit, that could create a lot of political issues for him, particularly given the fact that in some more months we're expecting the midterms. And midterms in America are very important, because if you lose your majorities, right now Republicans have majorities in both the houses of Congress. If they lose that, then he could become a lame duck president. And the Democrats might even try some sort of impeachment, which they have publicly stated already. So that is something that he's very cognizant of, I believe. So that is, and that is why you see they want an accelerated process of negotiations that could lead to some tangible agreement, even if it's a framework agreement. So that they, from in his sort of words, so that they could move on. I mean, analysts have a point, like historically, it has been always witnessed that Iran, they're very meticulous about any negotiations. They take their time. They don't want it to be rushed. And sometimes, because they play the waiting game as well. In fact, JCPOA itself, which was signed in 2015, is a testament to that fact. The actual negotiations on that started in 2009. And then the formal rounds of negotiations, when they began around 2013 or 14, they lasted 18 months. So yeah, that because that is the style of diplomacy that they conduct. They don't want sort of things to be sort of decided in what they believe is a rush. They want to take their time. They're very meticulous, and they believe that time is on their side, because the more the process gets protracted, the economic cost would increase, the political cost would increase for America and Israel, perhaps as well, even for Netanyahu, perhaps so much that they would be willing to make more concessions. That risk is always there. This, I believe, is a critical period during which, the risk of a return to escalation, and not just escalation, an uncontrolled escalation, is formidable. And that is why I believe the two sides have to be very careful that there's no return to hostilities, because that would be mutually destructive. So, but unfortunately, the risk is very much there, because, on the one side, we have to remember that President Trump is very mercurial. He's unpredictable as well, and he's getting frustrated. It seems quite evident now that he never wanted such a protracted war, and when he gets frustrated, and when sort of you can run out of patience, then you could resort to some drastic measures. On the other hand, in Iran, what is happening there? What we see, particularly from a lot of media reports, and not just media reports, from a lot of statements emanating from Iran, from the political leadership and the various shades of opinion, that in Iran, as the time passes, the hardliners, they are emerging stronger. So I think that increases the risk of return to escalation. So that is why it's so very important, number one, that this process of dialogue, it does not break down. Okay, there could be deadlocks. Deadlocks always happen, but the process should remain intact. And that is why Pakistan's role, which has been pivotal so far, becomes even more crucial in the days to come. No, I think that's a very important development, and I was fearing that, to be honest. This was my concern because from the American side as well, if you noticed, this visit was being delayed. They were supposed to arrive yesterday, and then, like if they were supposed to leave in perhaps even day before, and then sort of, but that all depended on sort of, what the Iranians were doing, the signals emanating from Tehran, and so this is not a good sign. That is a deadlock again, and I think this creates more challenges for this whole process. Definitely, that could be a basis for a grand bargain, so to speak. But the fact is that, look, the core issue is the nuclear issue. The sanctions and the unfreezing of assets is just linked to that. It's the sanctions came into play being because of the nuclear concerns that the U.S. had. The assets were frozen because of those nuclear concerns and to put pressure on Iran. So I think that is one issue. It's basically two sides of the same coin, so to speak. Now, so far as the Strait of Hormuz, blocking of the Strait of Hormuz is concerned, and so far as the U.S. naval blockade is concerned, I believe that, okay, those are again linked to the nuclear issue because Iran blocked the Strait of Hormuz to create a huge leverage that it could use as a bargaining enhancement tool to enhance its bargaining positions, so to speak. On the other side, U.S. They effected this naval blockade to neutralize that leverage that they think Iran had created. So basically, that is a leverage point for both the sides. But the real issue is the nuclear issue, and to a lesser degree, okay, the Iran's regional sort of ingress, but again, those Americans talk about their missile program as well, their proxies, and sort of and Iran talks about U.S. Drawing down of U.S. military presence in the region and war reparations and all that. But I think those are points which are like they're more like bargaining points. The actual the core issue is the differences on the nuclear aspect. See, that would be very unfortunate. Like, if the escalations begin again or are resumed again, and Americans attack Iran or bomb Iran, and Iran in retaliation starts striking the Gulf countries. I think that would be a tragedy because, it's Muslims on the both sides. And the Gulf countries, they had nothing to do with this conflict. They didn't start this conflict. And that is why Pakistan's position has been so clear on that. While we condemned the violation of territorial integrity, and we were very clear on the violation of Iran's sovereignty when the Americans did that and the Israelis did that, both last year and now. We also condemned the territorial, violation of territorial integrity of the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, and violation of this sovereignty by Iran, because then as they say, two sort of like injustices cannot create one, or two wrongs cannot create one right. So I think we are very clear on that. This should not happen.